If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 18, reading from verse 28 to chapter 19, verse 16. It's on page 1087 of your pew Bibles. Although Easter has passed, we're going back to a passage that's related to that, but really to our theme this morning. So John chapter 18, verse 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. And may God add his blessing to the reading of his word. As we look at events in our world today, we can often be left confused and anxious. There have been the great shifts in our political systems at home and across the Western world. And there's the marginalization and vilification of Christianity in the public square. In North Africa, the Middle East and further beyond, there is the daily persecution and killing of our brothers and sisters in Christ. And these things may cause us to be anxious, to have that deep sense of foreboding. We might even ask ourselves, who's really in control of all of this? The answer to that question will depend on your worldview. And although there are any number of diverse cultures and religions, there are really only two major worldviews: the view from outside and the view from inside. The view from outside is the human perspective that understands things purely through the senses and experience. But there's the view from inside, which is God's perspective, which tells us that God is the one in control, and it comes to us through divine revelation. We'll see in our passage this morning that these two worldviews interact in one of the most important events in human history. And by looking at this, we'll be more equipped to understand what's going on around us today and answer the question of who is really in control. As we come to our passage, we see that these two worldviews are divided up for us nicely by John himself, as he gives us 7 scenes that take place either outside or inside the Roman governor's palace. We're going to follow his lead and look at each one in turn, looking first at the view from outside, which is the human perspective on these events. It's around 33 AD in the ancient city of Jerusalem. Tensions are running high, as they often do, around the Feast of Passover. An itinerant Jewish rabbi from Galilee has caused quite a stir in the city, and he's really ticked off a number of the Jewish leaders. The religious fundamentalists, the Pharisees, they hate that Jesus spends so much time with the outcast and sinner. Then there's the freedom-fighting zealots who want to cast off the oppression of Rome, and they despise Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. Then we have the Sadducees, those who make up the priesthood and the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, and they fear that Jesus' popularity with the people will be exploited by the zealots. After all, you see, they had a good relationship with Rome, who let them exercise their religious power. In fact, back in chapter 11, verse 48, they express their concern most clearly when they say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. The word place there is literally our temple. But it's not just the Jews who are concerned this Passover, because when you see the number of people that come into the Passover, thousands of people coming into the city, they knew that there was going to be some trouble, especially at the highest festival in the year, a festival that spoke about casting off the oppression of another foreign power. So the Romans know they need to heighten security. The regional Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, has moved from his home in Caesarea with a large detachment of troops into the Antonia in Jerusalem, or the Praetorium, or the governor's palace, as it says here. What we know of this man in sources outside the Bible is that he had already come to the negative attention of the emperor through a couple of unfortunate incidents. And his mentor, Sejanus, who had helped him to get this job in the first place, who had been the Emperor Tiberius's right-hand man, had not only fallen out with the emperor, but he had also been executed by him. Pilate knows that he cannot afford for anything to go wrong this Passover. But from all earthly perspectives, Pilate is really the most powerful man in this entire region. But we're going to see in our passage that that power is challenged on several fronts. Verse 28 sets the scene. It's early in the morning, and the Jews who had arrested Jesus the night before are bringing him, after his trial with Caiaphas the high priest, to the Roman governor so that he can carry out the sentence of execution they had already pronounced. See, the Jews realized that since 6 AD, the Romans had removed their right to capital punishment, so that's why they needed Pilate. Of course, there had been, through mob violence, a number of unauthorized stonings, but Jesus was much too popular for that to work. The only way they could have him executed was through the express dictate of the Roman governor. But this whole scene seeps with a deep sense of irony, as these men are unwilling to go into the governor's palace in case they become ceremonially unclean. As it says, they wanted to eat the Passover, and they feared that entering the home of a Gentile ruler would make them unclean and unfit to participate in the festival. It's these men who are so scrupulous about their religious ceremony, and yet they're ready to bring an innocent man to his death. It's as Mounce puts it, concern for ceremonial purity took precedence over the demand for moral integrity. And isn't that true of all man-made religion today? That has more concern with ceremony and tradition than it has with justice and morality. I wonder how we are doing as God's people today. Well, verses 29 to 32 give us the first major scene set outside. In verse 29, Pilate goes out to the Jews. Actually, as the supreme governor, he could have forced them to come into him. But in wanting to avoid an uprising, he steps out to them. It seems that the Jews have the upper hand in this battle for control. However, Pilate asks a rather peculiar and strange question. He says, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" This was a surprising question, because just the night before, Pilate had given a detachment of the troops to the Jews in order to arrest Jesus. The fact that he was asking such a question showed he was going to conduct a normal trial, and he wouldn't become the puppet of these men doing their whim and will. That's why they respond with such flippancy and disdain in verse 30, and they say, "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." In other words, don't ask stupid questions. You know why we brought him to you. Brash words from those who had no real control, who needed Pilate, but they believed they were justified in what they were saying. Pilate then, in a sense, knowing that they have no right to crucify Jesus, says in verse 31 that they ought to take him and judge him by their own law. You can almost imagine the glee in Pilate's voice as he was subtly reminding them that he was the only one with the power over life and death, and that they needed him. The Jews then explicitly admit their position when they say, "But we have no right to execute anyone." Contented with this, Pilate heads inside to interrogate the prisoner and find out if there's any grounds for a charge against him. Once we see Pilate have the conversation with Jesus, he comes out again to the scene outside in verse 38, and he tells them for the first of 3 times, "I find no basis for a charge against him." If Pilate had been a man of moral integrity, he would have left it at that and let the prisoner go. But he's much too shrewd a character. He knows the Jews won't be satisfied with this answer, so he tries to box clever in order to remove his own responsibility in the affair. He appeals in verse 39 to the Jewish tradition of allowing one of their prisoners to go free at the time of Passover, and he offers them Jesus. He says, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" But his plan backfires. Verse 40, they shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Not only did the Jewish leaders not accept the offer of Jesus, but now they were asking for a man described elsewhere as notorious, and here in John's Gospel as one who had taken part in a rebellion, an insurrection against Rome. Added to Pilate's problem of Jesus, he now had to let a man go who was a known threat to the Roman Empire. That's why we see in chapter 19, verses 1 to 3, that out of frustration and in a tantrum trying to exercise his control, he has the prisoner flogged. A man who, remember, just moments before he had declared to be innocent. It seems that Pilate is losing control here. However, to be fair, he may have hoped that the mockery and the beating of this helpless and harmless rabbi would have aroused some compassion in the Jewish authorities. In verse 4, we see him coming out with pomp and ceremony and drama, and he says, "Look, I'm bringing him out to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." In verse 5, we see the pathetic and bloodied figure of Jesus standing in mock royal dress, forced upon him by the Roman soldiers. And Pilate again declares, "Here is the man." He spoke much better than he actually understood. But what he was saying was, here is no threat. How utterly pretentious are his desires to be a king. Well, this image of Jesus in mock royal dress just infuriates the Jewish leaders more. And their chief priests and their officials cry out, verse 6, "Crucify, crucify." They were urgent in their words, maybe hoping that nobody in the crowd would gain compassion for this rabbi. They wanted to shut that off as quickly as possible. So Pilate then says to them, "Take him and crucify him yourself." He knows that the Jews have no right to do this, but he's losing control and he's clutching at straws. Then we see that the Jews play their first big move in verse 7. They tell him that they have a law, and according to that law he must die because Jesus had claimed to be the Son of God. Blasphemy to the Jews. They were reminding him that as the occupying force, Rome had promised to uphold their religious law and, if necessary, to enforce it. If these claims had any legitimacy whatsoever, then that meant that Pilate was in a real predicament. Added to this was the fact that the title Son of God was often ascribed to the reigning Roman emperor, and if Jesus was claiming that title, then he was a genuine threat to Rome. So, in verses 8 to 11, we see Pilate go inside again to interrogate Jesus once more. But when he comes out in verse 12, he's more certain than ever before that he's no threat, that he is actually an innocent man, and he tries to set him free. But he can't. The most powerful man in the entire region has no control whatsoever. The final straw then comes in verse 12, when the Jews insist again that if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. With these words, Pilate knows that an uprising could be at hand, something his political career could never recover from, so he gives in to their whim. In verses 14 and 15, he's left to resort to cheap barbs against the Jews, persistently calling Jesus their king just to irritate them. In fact, he'll have a charge written above Jesus' cross that he is the king of the Jews, simply to aggravate his opponents. It seems that the Jews are the ones who are in control here, that they have won the victory. But at what cost? Look again at verse 15. When Pilate insists again that Jesus is their king, they come back to him and they say, "We have no king but Caesar." Words one would never have expected to come from the mouth of a religious Jewish person who believed that God alone was to be the king of Israel. They had insisted that Jesus was the one who had committed blasphemy, but they had just committed it themselves. This whole scene seems like a struggle and a battle for control between two parties, the Jewish leaders and Pilate. There is move and counter-move as each tries to gain control. But who is really in control of all of this? Yes, the Jews got what they wanted. They got Jesus handed over to be crucified. But to what end? Remember, their greatest fear was that the Romans would come and take away both their place and their nation. And in fact, that would happen within 40 years, when in 70 AD the Romans would come and destroy the temple and slaughter thousands of their citizens. And what of Pilate, the man who washed his hands of all responsibility, that had an innocent man killed just to save his own political career? History tells us that he would again fall foul of the Roman emperor, and he would have had to stand trial in front of him in Rome if he hadn't already committed suicide. And what of Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Chairman Mao? What do all these men have in common other than they're already dead and buried? Well, each and every one of their attempts at supreme control over humanity have ultimately failed. Take the most successful of those, Chairman Mao, who during the Cultural Revolution in China had tried to eradicate Christianity from the face of the country. He kicked out the missionaries and Christian workers and tried to destroy the churches. Well, what was the outcome for him? Over 40 years after his death, the church in China is stronger than it's ever been before, with hundreds of millions of Christians in that great nation. From the view from outside, the human and sociological perspective, this makes no sense whatsoever. But from the view from inside, we see that everything is not quite as it seems on the surface. That's why we need to turn again and look at our passage from the view from inside, from God's perspective on these events. As we've looked at our passage, we've neglected to speak much of a very important character, and that, of course, is Jesus. To all outward appearances, Jesus is simply the pawn in this game of chess, and he has no control over that which goes on around him. Jesus is the weak and bloodied victim of the Jews and Pilate, with no power to change his circumstances whatsoever. But is that really true? Is that the case? Well, we see again in chapter 18, verse 28, that Jesus is brought to trial in front of the Roman governor. While the Jews and Pilate are having their war of words outside, Jesus stands silently inside the Roman governor's palace. As they discuss with one another who really has the right to execute this man, John gives us this telling aside in verse 32. He said this happened that the words that Jesus spoke, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Jesus had predicted on a number of occasions that he would be crucified. And in fact, in John's Gospel, he said at least 3 times that he was going to be lifted up. It was necessary for Jesus to be handed over to the Romans to fulfill the words that he himself had spoken about his death. Remember the charge that was brought against Jesus by the Jews, that he had committed blasphemy. Well, according to Leviticus 24:16, the sentence for such was death by stoning. The fact that Jesus was going to be crucified tells us 2 things. Firstly, that this happened according to the foreordained plan of God. The disciples would come to see that in Acts 4:28. They say as much. God is the one in control here. But also, secondly, in Deuteronomy 21:23, we're told anyone who is hung on a tree is bearing the curse of God. But Pilate has tried his best to find a charge against him, and he can't. Jesus is an innocent man. So the fact that he's hanging there on the cross, bearing the curse, means he's bearing it for somebody else, bearing it for the sins of you and me. This is no helpless victim. In verse 33, we see Pilate go inside and summon Jesus for a conversation. He asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The pronoun is emphatic here. He's saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus doesn't strike Pilate as much of a kingly figure. Jesus' response in verse 34 as to whether this had come to Pilate from somebody else or come from his own initiative really serves a twofold purpose. If this was a genuine inquiry from Pilate himself, then the answer to his question would be no. Pilate thought of kingship in political terms, exercised by force. But we've already seen in John's Gospel in chapter 6, verse 15, Jesus had rejected the intentions of those who wanted to make him king by force. He had no political aspirations. But if the question had come from the Jews, then it was a question about whether he was the Messiah, that is, the true King of Israel. In that case, the answer would be yes. But Jesus is also appealing to Pilate's conscience so that he will conduct a fair trial and not be swayed by the opinions of others. Pilate's response in verse 35, "Am I a Jew?" is his way of saying, I am my own man, and I won't be swayed by the opinions of people not my own. After all, as he says to Jesus, it was your people and your chief priests who brought you to me. What is it you have done? Jesus' response to that question would not be understood either by the Jews or by Pilate. Jesus said, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." Both the Jews and Jesus' disciples had also misunderstood what the coming of the Messiah would mean and the nature of his kingdom. They too thought in political terms of a Messiah who would come and destroy the Romans and sit on a throne in Jerusalem. But Jesus' kingdom would not come that way. They could only see things from the outside. Jesus was letting Pilate see things from the inside. His kingdom was of a different order altogether. It wouldn't come through threat and force, but through love. It was wholly other, spiritual and internal. It would make no sense for Jesus' disciples to fight with the weapons of this world, because his kingdom would not be established that way. These words would reassure Pilate that Jesus was no real threat. And Pilate says as much in verse 37 when he says, "You are a king then." His words are inferential rather than negative. But just to make sure that he understands, Jesus again insists, "For this reason I came into the world, and for this I was born, that I might testify to the truth. Everyone who listens, everyone who is on the side of truth will listen to me." Jesus is saying to Pilate, "Look, I'm trying to show you what's really going on here, to help you understand and comprehend what's happening. I've come to testify to the truth, and everyone on the side of truth will listen to me." This whole time, Pilate and the Jews have believed that Jesus is the one on trial. But in fact, it's Pilate who's now on trial. But will he listen to Jesus? Will he listen to the truth and go free? Well, verse 38, he replies wearily, "What is truth?" He's not asking a philosophical question about the nature of truth. What he is saying is, what good is truth to me right now? It's not going to change my circumstances, and it certainly won't help yours. With this response, Pilate, like Herod before him, has now forfeited any right to hear the truth from Jesus again. Can I ask you this morning, how many times has Jesus approached you and opened up the truth of what's going on? He's pulled back the curtain and he's offered you true life, to enter into the reality of what is true. But you've said time and again, "What good is that to me right now?" Please don't leave this morning without entering into that life and truth. Well, we see again a deep sense of irony in chapter 19, verses 1 to 3, where Pilate hands Jesus over to the soldiers so that they can conduct this mock coronation of the King of the Jews. Little did these men realize that the one that they mocked, they beat, they spat upon and flogged, was not only the true King of Israel, but the King of the universe. To me, it's almost incomprehensible what these men will think and what everyone who rejects Jesus and mocks him will think when he returns in power to judge the earth and causes every knee to bow and every tongue to confess his divine kingship. We don't have time this morning to explore all of the intricacies of the view from inside, but I want to take you to those verses which speak of this more clearly than any other. Look again at verses 8 to 11 of chapter 19. Pilate has just been shocked by the Jews' claim that Jesus was calling himself the Son of God. Not only would Pilate see this as a challenge to Caesar's rule, but as a superstitious man, he would be a little afraid of Jesus' claim to be a divine figure. The Romans had plenty of stories of the gods coming to earth, so he wouldn't want to risk angering the gods by killing one of their own. That's why it says in verse 8 that he's so afraid. And he goes back in again in verse 9, and he asks Jesus, "Where do you come from?" He's asking, "Who are you?" or "What are you?" But Jesus remains silent. Pilate takes this as insubordination against his control, and with anger he stomps back verse 10. "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not realize that I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Picture the scene. Everything goes quiet. The rabble outside can no longer be heard. Jesus slowly lifts his battered and bruised head, blood streaming down his face from the crown of thorns. He looks Pilate dead in the eye, and he says with supreme authority, verse 11, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Here is the man speaking the truth of the situation. To all outward appearances, Jesus was the weakest party, the hapless and helpless victim of circumstance. But Jesus has turned the tables. He's shown Pilate what's really going on, who's really in control here. The only reason Jesus stood there in that moment in history was because he chose it and the Father planned it. Yes, of course, the Jews and Pilate will be held responsible for their part in the death of the Son of God. Jesus says as much in verse 11. But make no mistake, against all outward appearances, Jesus is the one in control here. Jesus knew that the only way to rescue helpless sinners was through the path of pain that led to the cross, but he chose the nails. And by his resurrection, taking up his own life, he would conquer even death. What does that mean for us? Let me ask you this morning, what is it that causes you most anxiety and fear? Who or what seems to have control over your life right now? We need to hear Jesus' words and remember that that person or that thing would have no power over you except by the express permission of God. They might mean it for evil, but God means it for good. God is love. But just as the shame and the horror of the cross was actually the greatest expression and most beautiful picture of God's love, so our circumstances are working for our greater good and for God's glory. Of course, the disciples in the moment of the cross did not understand what was going on at all, but later they would come to understand. And we might not understand right now our own circumstances, but one day I believe we will. As the hymn writer says, they did not know as we know now. Though empires rise and fall, your kingdom shall not cease to grow, till love embraces all. No matter what the view from outside may present to us, the view from inside clearly declares, God is in control. Make sure that you're on his side. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word and the reminder of who is really in control of the circumstances of our lives. Lord, I pray that this morning we will not leave here simply asking, what good is that to me? What is truth? But we would embrace the truth of who you are, that even against all of outward appearances in our circumstances, that you are in control, that you are the one who is taking us to a greater glory. Let us put our hope and trust in you this day, for we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.